Like most modern people, unfortunately, I have very little knowledge of Latin language, and that's a real tragedy. I mean, it really is. Because it's so helpful, because of the words in our own language. So many of them, especially the words in philosophy, science, are derived from Latin or Greek. That knowledge of Latin and Greek can be a great thing in terms of gaining a better understanding of what the words in our language actually mean. But that's just a long way of saying that let's look at the title of this chapter, Chapter 7, on our knowledge of general principles, and let's focus on that word principle. Principle, related to the word prince. The Romans called Augustus Caesar the princeps, the first, really the first, and that, although my knowledge of Latin is pretty scanty, and if I look this up afterwards and I'm wrong, I'll just do another video, but the princeps and the root there, the Latin root, really gives us the notion of firstness. So principles, then what are they, if we think about that? They're the first things. The first things. The things that have priority. The things that come first. And in a certain way, they don't come first, temporally. That is, we don't think of the kind of principles that Russell is talking about first in our experience. The idea is that we dwell on our experience and we realize that they're already there and that their firstness is not dependent upon our being conscious of them. Let me give you some explanation of what I think that means and what Russell is getting at. Well, he says towards the beginning, in all our knowledge of general principles, what actually happens is that first of all, we realize some particular application of the principle, and then we realize that the particularity is irrelevant, and that there is a generality which may equally truly be affirmed. That is, that Russell is concerned here with, in this chapter, with our, as he says, our knowledge of general principles. General principles are not, strictly speaking, things. That is, when we know a general principle, we cannot be said to know a thing. What we know is a truth. The first one that he discusses is the truths about implication. But I think it's a little bit confusing. Let's look at what he lists as the principles of logic or the laws of thought. He lists, for instance, the law of identity, which is whatever is. The law of contradiction, sometimes called the law of non-contradiction. Nothing can both be and not be. And the law of excluded middle, everything must either be or not be. The idea is that these are true principles of logic. And the idea is that unlike empirical generalizations, like there are no talking dogs, or the future will be in its fundamentals much like the past, which are based upon experience, which depend upon experience for our thinking them at all, and whatever proof they have is with reference to experience, that these things, these truths, these ideas, these concepts are not dependent on experience. That is, what we find is that when presented with certain propositions like these three laws of logic, that we immediately assent to them. That is, we say, well, of course, that's true. And that we say that without any thought that we need to prove them. The whole idea of their firstness, the whole idea of their priority, of their truly being principles in the strongest sense of the word principle, is that they come first. And if we're thinking about proof, demonstration, establishing things, these are the things, these sort of principles are the things that we make use of to establish everything else, and that there's nothing deeper or more prior or more first that we can use to establish them. That is, I think what Russell is pointing out here is that there's a bedrock to our thought, and that we find that bedrock when we dwell upon the kind of thinking that we actually do, the kind of reasoning that we actually do, and we sort of discover the principles that we are forced to make use of if we are going to think at all. So what is the relationship between these principles and our experience? I mean, again, we're not conscious of these principles most of the time. If we become conscious of them, isn't it because of our experience? Yes. He says this, on the other hand, even that part of our knowledge which is logically independent of experience, in the sense that experience cannot prove it, is yet elicited and caused by experience. It is on occasion of particular experiences that we become aware of the general laws which their connections exemplify. It would certainly be absurd to suppose that there are innate principles, in the sense that babies are born with a knowledge of everything which men know, and which cannot be deduced from what is experienced. So what is he getting at there? That these principles, we can't be strictly said to know them in the fullest sense from the moment that we're born, if know means be conscious of. But what we find is that when it comes to true first principles, the kind of laws of logic, let's say, that he spells out, that even if we're not conscious of them, we realize we've been assuming their truth all along. That is, that their truth or our knowledge of them is logically independent of experience, meaning, as he says, that experience cannot prove them. That is, some of our general notions, like the thing about talking dogs, are not logically independent of experience, in the sense that only experience could give me any proof that there are no talking dogs. But if we think of one of the logical truths, principles, let's say the law of contradiction, nothing can both be and not be. Well, what could ever prove that in my experience? That is, the idea is that that's taken for granted at all times in my experience, and especially in my thought, my talking about the world, the statements that I make about the world. That is, if I say that that Paris is the capital of France, one of the things that I imply is that Paris is not the capital of France. That is, that either it's the capital of France or it's not. That actually sounds more like the law of excluded middle, but I hope I've gotten something across there. So the idea is that there are certain things that we know, certain truths, you might call them concepts here, that we know, that we perhaps need to have experience to stimulate the knowledge of those things, but that our knowledge of those things is not dependent upon experience. And again, empirical generalizations would be the contrast here. Anything that we say about the things in the world that exist, like the premise in the syllogism, all men are mortal, that's an empirical generalization. It's not immediately obvious, it's based upon our experience, and it can never be any more certain than any other generalization that we make on the basis of our experience, and that, according to Russell, is not certain at all, only to one degree or another probable. But it is very important to Russell's philosophy here that there are general principles that, number one, that we know in a different way than empirical generalizations. And these, I think, are the things with which we are directly acquainted. And number two, that our knowledge of them is absolutely certain, in the same sense that our knowledge of our sense data as sense data is absolutely certain, and that these principles we cannot doubt. That is, we cannot imagine a possible world in which they're not true. We can imagine a possible world in which dogs talk and in which men are not mortal, but we cannot imagine a possible world in which the laws of logic don't hold. And that gives the laws of logic and other general principles a completely different status, you can say a epistemological status, than any other truth that we think that we know about the world.